Hi, good evening. It's a great pleasure to share this evening with you. What I'm going to do tonight is share my journey on what I think is a very exciting prospect for the west coast of Scotland, but also for the whole of Scotland. Before I do, I've shared this journey with many people. Clearly my good lady Mary, who's been very patient at times. My researchers and staff in the Parliament and in AIR, the press, who've been very supportive, and others, and they all know who they are, who have provided me with support and advice and information. And latterly, and more recently, of course, that great Scot, Jim Sillars, who has been untiring, and not just on this issue, but on many issues, and has played such a key role in the independence debate over the last few weeks and months. Anyway, to the journey. It started some 3 years ago when I was canvassing in the constituency on Prestwick Main Street. And as you do as a candidate, you try and encourage conversations with the locals to determine what their issues are and so on. And I came upon this gentleman who was standing outside the Burns Bar in Prestwick. And before I could really engage him in the election issues, he said, what are you going to do about all the oil and gas in the Clyde? Now, we talked about it for a bit. I had been, he mentioned it was in the early 1980s that that he'd been employed as a drilling engineer, had met a local girl, got married, bought a house, and then after a couple of years, the whole scene stopped. And so we talked about that for a bit, but with the many things going on, I kind of put it at the back of my mind. Until one day I was talking to a senior official in one of the councils in the south of Scotland, which I represent, and we were talking about jobs and economic development. And somewhat half-heartedly I said, well, it'll be fine when we discover all the oil and gas in the Clyde. And whereupon he said, I remember that. He said, I was a schoolboy at Ayr Academy, and I remember the rigs between, it's just south of Annan and near Sandy Point, and there were 2 rigs. So I started to dig and try and find some information, and I pulled a council report of 1999 from Dumfries and Galloway, which alluded to the oil potential of the Firth of Clyde, south of the Firth of Clyde, and the Atlantic margins. And it kind of snowballed from there. What I did was I spent Saturday mornings looking in the archives of the local newspapers and finding stories that were associated with that in the early 1980s, and discovered this particular letter from, not letter, but article in the Times of June 1983, wherein the Secretary of State for Scotland, George Younger, who was the MP for Ayr, said that there were exploitable quantities of oil in the Clyde, and the oil companies were playing, holding their cards close to their chest. So that really got me going, and looking for more information. And then I decided to expand the story by sharing it with local newspapers in Ayrshire and in Argyll. And there was a welter of people phoning me and sending me emails saying, I remember that, and I worked on a supply ship, or I worked in the harbour at Ayr, and here's what was happening at Ardrossan, and do you know there was a village being planned at, and in fact was built at Portavadie in Argyll. So that story was picked up by a national newspaper and just encouraged me to go further. And that was helped by me getting an email from a person who knows who they are, and to whom I owe a lot of this story, this journey, this book, if you like. The email suggested I go and look at a particular file in the National Archives, which I did, and spent a day there with help going through this particular file. And at one stage, having found what I did find, I actually had to go out of the archives because I couldn't believe some of the stuff I was finding. There was a copy, of course, of the article in the Times of June 1983. There was an internal memo in the Scottish office saying that the Secretary of State's interview in the Times had been misrepresented. Well, they would say that, wouldn't they? Then in September 83, there was a letter from the Department of Energy saying that they had been instructed by the Ministry of Defence that there would be no drilling in the breadth of the Clyde. So that just encouraged me to, encouraged us, because as I say, I was helped by many people, to look for more and more information. And of course, you then get into what exploration there had been, and we found that there had been exploration by BP, for example, in 1981 and others, and that they'd applied for a production license. So off we went to try and find the information on the production license. Eventually we found, and for the benefit of those the Jeremiahs who don't believe that BP knew anything about this, then just for the record, the license number is PL262. And if anybody can find anything about license PL262, I have a map, I have some details, but BP and the government have refused to release details of that license. So it was there. That then encouraged me to open up freedom of information requests on the Ministry of Defence, on BP, and believe it or not, the Pentagon, who have been, and the Department of Defence in the States, because clearly what had been happening from the famous September 1983 letter from the Department of Energy was that a gentleman by the name of Mr. Roger Mansell, I don't know if he's still alive, if he is, I'd like to talk to him, Mr. Roger Mansell, who had indicated there would be no drilling, that here we had this cover-up, or what appeared to be a cover-up. And so it went on, and we chased information. I also got another tip-off about a letter that was in another file. I actually asked for the file, I was told there was one letter in it. When I asked to see it, I was told it was very heavily redacted. All of the key information had been blacked out. But I asked to see that, and I have it. This is one of the 3 binders I have, and this is like gold. Wherever I go, this goes with me. And that particular letter, which indicated that somebody had been buying up Ardrossan Harbour. And of course, when I made the request for the real letter, I was told that I couldn't get it because it had to have approval from the Scotland office in Edinburgh. So when I asked them if they would release it, what they said was, we've had to get approval from the Scotland office in London. I'm not, well, I suppose I'm fairly naturally conspiratorial, but this was evidence of a real cover-up. And to this date, despite chasing them, and I will continue to chase them, they have not released information. But of course, the big breakthrough came when I phoned Michael Heseltine some months ago and asked him if he could remember what had happened, because he was Secretary of State for Defence in the same Thatcher government as George Younger. I can't, because of we were on television, use the exact words he used, but they were not necessarily polite. But he said he was too old, he couldn't remember, and told me to get off. By that time, I'd been working with a Sunday newspaper who had covered this story at length and constructively. And again, I thank them for pushing me a bit further along this road, this journey. And eventually they pursued Mr. Heseltine, asking about things like the referendum, what have you. But in the course of the interview, and I'll just, if I may, just read this to you. In the course of the interview with Mr. Heseltine, the question was asked of him, and this really is the thing that underscored, underlined the work that had gone into this for 3 years. The question was put to him about the MOD and the exploitation of oil in the Clyde. And I'll just, if I may, read some of the questions that were put to him at the time. And this is in an email in 25th of June this year. First question was, Mr. Heseltine, you were Defence Secretary at the time the Ministry of Defence blocked the exploitation of oil off the west coast of Scotland, right? Heseltine's reply is, did we? Second question is, you didn't know anything about that decision. His answer is, what did we do? Next question from the paper, the reporter, was, there's oil off the west coast of Scotland. Various oil companies wanted to exploit that, but the Ministry of Defence blocked it on the basis there were nuclear submarines in the area. And here is the coup de grace. Heseltine said, of course, I do remember that. For the benefit of the doubters, he said, of course, I do remember that. And when he was asked, was that a wise decision politically, he said, that's not the right question. The question is whether it was right for strategic or defence reasons. The implication of your question is that, briefed as I would be on Britain's national security issues, someone should have said, yes, but the politics of this are unattractive. The politics of this are unattractive. So you override the strategic defence interests of Britain, and wait for this, for the sake of some poll in a local community council. You've got the wrong Secretary of State. Well, at that time, we actually did have the wrong Secretary of State and the wrong government, because what has happened is we've lost the opportunity, in my book, to develop all of the opportunities and develop the skills and the jobs in the west of Scotland, not just in Ayrshire, but in Inverclyde. And we know what's happened to the shipbuilding. Can you imagine what would have happened with oil rig development, with supply ships, supply chain? It may not have been in Aberdeen, but it certainly would have changed the face of the west and the southwest of Scotland. And so while we have been denied that, we've been asked to spend a fortune on the maintenance of nuclear submarines in Faslane and their passage through the Firth of Clyde. Of course, since then, we've had the development around the Clare Ridge field west of Shetland, which is supposed to be a monster field, and of course which the current Prime Minister visited secretly, without journalists, in July. And we've also heard of great opportunities in the west of Hebrides and all the way down the west coast of Scotland. I was in Ireland talking at the Oil and Gas Summit the Irish government had set up, and met developers there. One company that had been working off Rathlin Island, which is just a few miles south of Kintyre, had finished its exploration and reckons there might be 530 million barrels of oil in that particular area. And they have the same geological setup as the rest of Scotland. And it's not just the Clyde, it goes across some of the central belt. So we are where we are. Having been denied, as I say, that economic development, the jobs, families losing young people who have gone to work in London, for example, or abroad, that we might have retained. I'm not suggesting that people should always stay at home, but it certainly has riven some families in the past 30 years. I'm encouraged that the government, our government, has now set up a working group to look at the oil opportunities in the Firth of Clyde, in the Solway Firth, in the Atlantic margins, and in the west of Hebrides. And that is one of the reasons when people, particularly in the UK government, say that oil is declining, the answer to them is, you're talking nonsense. It's been a great pleasure sharing my journey with you. I'm not sure it's at its end yet, but I hope to share the further adventure with you over the coming months and years.